First up today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Raff Mares, who will be talking about trajVis, which is a web tool for viewing animal movement data on interactive maps. And Raff is a wildlife biologist and web developer based in Bristol with an interest in animal movement, spatial data visualization, and games for conservation. They've always been fascinated by how animals move in their environment and have been lucky to study this from ocelots to meerkats across the rainforest and the desert. So there's a really cool tool that Raff is demonstrating here. So I'm really excited to welcome you to speak to us. Thanks very much, Raff.
Thanks, James, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming along. So yeah, I'm a behavioral ecologist and a data scientist, and I'm going to talk about a web tool I created for viewing animal movement data on interactive maps. Okay, before I go into describing the tool, I just want to give a brief background on why I created this. The trajVis was born from the need of being able to quickly and easily share animal movement data. And this was done while I was working at Internet of Elephants. Internet of Elephants is a small company based in Kenya, and we use real wildlife data to tell conservation stories through mobile games and interactive digital experiences. So, for example, we partner with an organization studying orangutans in the wild in Borneo, and they give us their data on behavior, on feeding habits, and generally life history of the animals they're studying. And we use this data, or these data, to create a game like Wilderverse. Wilderverse is a game that recreates the experience of being a researcher in the field using augmented reality through your phone. And it recreates the experience of having to track animals and learn about them and collect data on the food they eat and also environmental data. So in this particular level, you need to follow Theo the orangutan. First of all, find it in this augmented reality forest, and also find evidence of the food they're eating. All this based on real data. So when we started the company, the first data that we started receiving was animal movement data. So this is data from GPS tags attached to an animal like this cuckoo. And these data are normally used for things like studying the home range of an animal, or in the case of the cuckoo, looking at migration patterns. But when we first reached out to the conservation organizations we wanted to work with, we got tons and tons of movement data, and we were quickly swamped. So being a company that is spread around the world, so me based here in Bristol and my colleagues in Kenya and in India, we needed to find an easy way to share the data. And in a way that it wasn't just easy for people with experience coding or developers to use the data, but for anyone in the company. So the first thing we thought about, well, we can just share videos. But the problem with videos is that everyone is so used to interactive maps, and videos obviously are, what you see is what you get. So people kind of there's a lot of back and forth with wanting to zoom into a particular point in space or a particular point in time. So that didn't really work out very well. And of course, there are lots of programs that you can use, like R and QGIS for analyzing spatial data. But again, not everyone knows how to code, and it's not really easy to dive into these programs. So we wanted something that didn't require installing any software, didn't require any coding knowledge or any manipulation of the data. So this is why I decided to create trajVis. And being a behavioral ecologist with lots of experience in the field, tracking animals and collecting movement data myself, I figured this could be a useful tool for others to quickly explore their data sets. So we decided to make the tool a bit more user-friendly and release it as open source. Okay, so what is trajVis? So trajVis is a web-based tool that aims to perform largely aims to perform two tasks. The first is to take a CSV file with location data for one or multiple animals. And this data set just needs to have the minimum number of variables and in the most popular formats, and take this data and render it as layers of points and lines on an interactive map. And two, it needs to allow the user to filter the data by time and be able to view the data as if it were a video. The code for processing the data is all written in JavaScript, and the code basically parses the CSV file with location data provided by the user. It quickly checks the data for major errors, like missing columns or the wrong date format. It finds the sample interval and normalizes the timestamp. So rounds the timestamps to the nearest multiple of the sample interval and interpolates any missing timestamps. And this is done for smoother playback. And finally, it creates the necessary objects for rendering the data on the interactive map. Initially, trajVis relied heavily on Mapbox.gl.js. This is a JavaScript library, and it used it for the interactive maps and also for rendering the layers. But before releasing the tool, as an open source tool, I switched to DeckGL for the layers because it can handle hundreds of thousands of data points without affecting performance. So speaking of performance, I should probably mention that trajVis was the first tool I created, and I wasn't 100% sure what I was doing as a web developer. So there's probably lots of things that can be improved. And if you are interested in this kind of thing, I would encourage you to have a look at the code and pick it apart. trajVis also has other cool features like allowing you to show and hide the point and line layers. You can filter the data by animal ID. You can display a graph that has the cumulative distance traveled by each of the animals in the data set. And it also allows you to create very simple videos using the screen capture API. Okay, so having told you what trajVis is and how it works, I'm going to give you a quick demo of how this all works in practice. But first, the data. So you'll need a data set, obviously, if you're going to use trajVis, and this needs to be in a CSV file, and it can contain data for a single animal or for multiple animals. Well, it doesn't have, it can be any species, obviously, it can be people as well if you want. I know people have used it to display drone data, so it's really any type of movement data. But the main thing, it needs to have 5 columns. So it needs a species, animal ID, a timestamp. So that's date and time as year, month, day, hour, minute, seconds. And it needs longitude and latitude in decimal degrees. You can also give it altitude. That's optional, and I'll talk a bit about altitude later on. Okay, so now I am going to go into the demo. So to access trajVis, you just need a browser. I'm using Chrome, and I think Chrome-based browsers probably work the best, but I think you can use any other browser. It should work fine. Anything that supports WebGL will work. I'm going to make it full screen. Yeah, okay. So the first thing is to load a data set. If you don't have one yourself, you can also get a sample file. Just by clicking here, you'll download the data, and then you just get it from your computer. Okay, so click here. It'll ask me to load a data set. Choose one here. Open. So it's reading the data. That applies you to where your data is located, and then all you have to do is press play. Okay, so basically 2 steps: loading the data and then pressing play, and then you're all set. But of course, you've got this time scrubber here, so you can move forwards and backwards in time. You can add reduce data. You can play it as continuous, so it's just adding more and more data, or you can view it as a data window by clicking on this window button here at the bottom. And of course, you can change the playback speed. Because it's an interactive map, you can treat it as any interactive map, Google Maps or whatever. You see here on the right side of the screen, you've got these buttons here. Those are the animal IDs. So you can remove or add animals to the data set. So I should point out that when you load a data set, it color codes the animals by, if you have more than one species, it color codes them by species. Otherwise, it color codes them by animal ID. You can view the actual locations, so each of the individual locations in addition to the lines, and remove them. And then you can hover over these points and it tells you what the underlying data for each of those points. Next to the points and lines, you've got this, which shows you the distance, the cumulative distance, so the distance traveled for each of the animals. And these little line indicators show you where you are in the data set. Obviously, the distance data is smooth, so not exactly how far each animal moved, but it's smooth to reduce the number of data points. You can also change the base layer. If I click this map styles button here at the bottom. So these are all from Mapbox. And you've got a dark layer. And then of course a satellite. I jumped over one. I'm just trying to get to the satellite layer, but I think I accidentally double clicked. Yeah, there you go. We've got the satellite layer as well. Okay, and once you've reached the end of your playback, you can go back and play again. Just switch back to this light layer. The other thing is you've got a little help function here that tells you everything you can do, and it provides a link to the GitHub page where you can see the underlying code. And one other function is that you can do record. Because this relies on the screen capture API, I don't want to click it now. I don't know how to respond to me sharing the screen on Zoom and then also trying to share the screen to do the recording. But it's a very basic recording that outputs I think it's called a WebM file. And these are small video files that you can immediately share on Twitter or other social media. So you don't need to change the format or anything. And the last function is change the data set. So you don't have to refresh the browser. Just click on this button here and it allows you to add another data set. So the one I was showing before is quite a small data set. I'm going to try to load a bigger data set, which has hundreds of thousands of points. It'll take a little bit longer to load, but it should be fine. The reason why I'm loading this data set is that I can quickly show what it looks like when you have altitude data added to your data set. In the case of this first one that I showed, it didn't have altitude data. Okay, so these are spider monkeys in Panama. Of course, they're in the trees. So the altitude bit doesn't work perfectly. There are some rendering errors, which I haven't gotten around to checking exactly why they happen. But it's nice that the functionality is there. So it can be explored a bit further. And, you know, we can imagine looking at vulture data, very high resolution vulture data going up into the sky, and it would look quite cool with this type of data, with this type of visualizer. And I think that is it. Just going to leave, end it with this slide here. Again, this is the website for the tool, Internet of Elephants, GitHub.io trajVis. Code and usage, obviously hosted on GitHub. And if you want more information about the work we do, or about this tool in particular, you can look at my website, Raff Mares, GitHub.io, or the Internet of Elephants website as well. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Raff. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I didn't know about the altitude data part of the tool, so it was really interesting and really cool to see how that works. We'll move on now to Dr. Seb Steinig, who's at the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol, and they'll be talking about Climatearchiveorg, the Google Earth for climate data. And just a quick introduction to Seb, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Geographical Sciences, currently using numerical models and paleoclimate data to understand how and why climate has changed in the past. And they're particularly interested in how we can share our climate model data and research findings with the wider public. So we've kind of got a little bit of a theme going on about communicating data in our DataViz talk today. So Seb, it's great to have you with us, and looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, James, for the introduction. Thanks for having me. So just start sharing as well here, everything. So yeah, the Climatearchive.org. Yeah, I call it like the Google Earth for climate data. It's like, yeah, that's the wannabe title. I want to be at that stage at some point, but hopefully I made some progress in this direction. But I think it just like conveys a bit of like the idea where we're heading with the project and what you can expect from the website. I call it Google Earth. So this is mainly work done here in Bristol. So Dan Land, Paul Valdez, Chris Cortese, main people who provided a lot of the data that is going into this website. And all this work is in collaboration with Tessa Alexander from Research IT from Bristol. I will talk about this a bit later on. Just very roughly, like outlines, just like I just wanted to start, of course, like, yeah, if we're talking about climate model data, what kind of data we're talking about, what we want to visualize in the end, and then, yeah, how we implement this, so how we visualize this. And the important thing that what was, at least for me, new is like doing a bit of coding, not on the CPU, but on the GPU, so the graphic processor. Talk about this a bit, and then hopefully just show you just some demo about about the different concepts of the platform and how it works. I think it's much easier than just talking about it. So yeah, climate models in general. So these models are very similar to what we know from, like, for example, from weather forecast models. And they are just like trying to represent everything that we know, or most of what we know about the basic physical, chemical, biological processes on the Earth system. And then we try to have like a numerical representation of them. And so we basically divide the Earth system in different realms, like the atmosphere, the ocean, vegetation, and so on. And then we lay this sort of like chessboard over it to define a grid, a global grid horizontally and also vertically, to have like a lot of these grid boxes. And for each of those boxes, we try to solve like equations, for example, relating to energy transport, circulation, solar radiation going in and out, vegetation. and so on, like basically our understanding, our current understanding of these processes, we're trying to solve for each of those grid boxes. What I'm always fascinated about these climate models is that they are really, really flexible. And it's not like, I always get the question, like whether those are just like designed or tuned to just like represent what we're about our current climate system and maybe like the next 100 years. But what we are doing is really like we're applying them to really, really different settings. So all the way deep into the past for the time periods of the dinosaurs, of course, for the present, we look at our futures, but we even use like the same models, in principle, the same models to also like study and understand maybe potential exoplanets and their atmospheric dynamics on them. So they are really, really flexible in terms of the application. And but one of the problems, of course, is like as they represent like global processes on this gridded data set, I will produce like a lot of those output variables and on relatively large files and sometimes quite complex grid definitions. So they're not really like the easiest files to approach and to share with other people. One of the common ways is just make a screenshot here from something we call like the CBIP6 data sets, which is like underlying like the latest IPCC report on climate change. It's just like we commonly use, like, for example, to look for these data sets online, we use some sort of like a search mask where you filter by variable, experiment name, and so on. And then you could just get like a long list of files that are in a .nc, so netcdf file format, which is like really for this gridded data set, which is the standard. And you can then download and then basically, run them through your whatever Python scripts or MATLAB scripts, what you're using them. So it's fine for like the experts, but it's not really easy and convenient for sharing. Here in Bristol, we have a bit of a nicer setup, basically, which means like once our simulations are run, they're like, for example, basically like automated scripts that already produce some sort of like basic plots that we always tend to look at different simulations. So you always get like figures for the model geography, the vegetation, circulation patterns, and so on, that basically get created automatically, and which is a bit easier to digest for some people and share with other people. But still, like, once we're going to like dozens or hundreds of different simulations that we're doing for a single research question that we have, this doesn't really scale very well. And it's also always tough to really make some sort of like connections between different variables, because normally like this Earth system is highly interconnected between different realms, but these different figures, they always put like a lot of like air between like the different components, and it's tough to really make the connection between them. So what I always thought is like there are other existing solutions already out there, and like there's some really cool work already been done. And what I always wanted to have is some sort of like, I thought like some virtual globe would be perfect for representing our data, because I mean, that's in the end what we're looking at. We're trying to simulate like this three-dimensional Earth system. So representing it, visualizing it on an actual like three-dimensional globe is really like, I think, like the natural way going forward. And we all know some examples of this, for example, like Google Earth, Google Maps. Probably everybody's used one of those globes, just like dragging around the globe to just navigate around the world. Is very, very intuitive, especially on maybe like a touchscreen device, and most of the people are already familiar with this. Another cool example I always like to look at is like the Earth wind map, which you see here on the right, displaying near real-time like global weather data, circulation data. You can see here surface winds displayed, which I always liked to look at, for example, like when there's like a new hurricane in the news, to really follow the tracks. So there's like already cool software out there, and I think like there's like a huge potential for those virtual globes to really be helpful for, first of all, interdisciplinary research, because you want to share this with people that are not really familiar with looking at climate model data every day, but also for education. Like, so always like students like to work with these virtual globes, and also we use it for a lot of like public outreach, because it's just like very easy to communicate your data. So I actually started with this Earth wind map, which is here on the right, because this was open source available on the internet, and I always wanted to build something like this. So I thought I started with this, but the problem, of course, is always like we're just, most of us at least, we are like scientists and not really like software developers, but it's at least for me. So when I started this project like roughly like a year ago, so I didn't know like what HTML or CSS is. Probably I don't even know it now, I have to admit, and I've never written like a single line of JavaScript or something like this. So I really needed some help. And so I applied for the seed funding from the Gene Golding Institute, which was really helpful because I could then partner up with the research IT team from the University of Bristol, because they really provide like help with professional research software engineering. And this was really like, yeah, this all got like the project started because they really helped me, and especially Tess Alexander that really helped me a lot of basically in getting or taking my idea and putting this into some sort of software solution in the end. So the software which I wanted to start with, this Earth Wind Map, the public repository was quite outdated, very old, and they soon suggested that it's quite a lot of work to update all of these all of these old libraries. So we decided to write something new from scratch. And for the technical implementation, how we did this, so I always wanted similar to what Raff was showing, like a one-page website, so like single-page application that just runs on any browser without the need to install any additional software, because I always thought like this would put people off using this in the end. Basically, I just wanted to have some link that you can click on Twitter or whatever and just get started with playing with the data. And since I wanted to build something like a really like three-dimensional environment, so I looked for a library that basically allows you to do this. And what I used in the end is a library called 3.js. So and yeah, basically you can already see from the screenshot that it's designed to build like these three-dimensional geometries and surfaces in the web browser, and this was ideal for my purpose. And the interesting thing there is that it uses a library that's called like Web Graphics Library, or short WebGL. And this is it's called like a real-time renderer. I will talk about this in a second. But what this means is that we actually have like access to like the GPU on the machine. So like really a lot of graphics power, much more than normally when we just use the CPU. And in general, you can think about this as more like similar to just creating a sort of like a video game, like a world in a video game. It's more similar to this than just a traditional like Python or MATLAB script. So the different components that we have there for like sort of like this three-dimensional app is, so we have to define some sort of like a scene, and you can think about this more like maybe like a movie set or something like this. So we set up like our objects in this like what we call like a mesh, for example, like our Earth, put this in the center, or like a tree or ocean currents or whatever we want, put all of this into our scene, and then we add some lights, like a camera position to this, and then we send everything to what's called like the renderer. And this renderer is then really responsible for drawing this scene onto the screen of our device. And the interesting thing here is like that this is doing this constantly. It's not like a Python script where you just run it once and create a figure, but it does this ideally 60 frames per second, which means like every change that we do to our app, basically we get a real-time feedback. So if we change like the camera position, rotate our Earth, for example, then it will constantly be updated, and we get this idea of like a feedback or real-time feedback, which really helps for interactivity, I think. So, and for this, we need like a GPU support, so like the graphics processor underneath, and just for the end, basically, the important thing here is like that these GPUs, so really to use all this power, they normally work best with like, or only work with textures, which means like some sort of like images. So we don't really put like some arrays in there, but we work with textures. So one of the pre-processing steps that I had to do is like we needed to take what we normally use like netcdf, so our global gridded data, and then I transcoded this to PNG images. So which means like we have like different channels in the PNG image, for example, the red, green, blue, and of course different levels of precision. In my case, like 8 bits of data, so we have like 256 values for each of those channels, and then we can use those channels to basically store the data in and easily work with this in the browser, because it's quite easy to work with like images in the browser. And PNG is also very nice because it has like lossless compression. What we do then is basically for different time periods, I just create more or less like a movie strip of different time periods, and then I can store all the data in these PNG images. In this case, for example, for surface vegetation. So in this case, I store like maybe like a land ice mask here in the blue channel, and some deserts in green, and so on. And this is the way how we basically put the data into in the browser. So wanted to show you how this works, like with a short demo. So happy to invite you to go to climatearchive.org, play with the site on your own, or just follow this demo. Let me just see. This is still up there. Just get rid of everything here for a moment to just maybe just start easy. So let's hide this one. So this is just wanted to start with this page. Don't worry about the bottom part, the timeline. We'll talk about this later. But this is more or less similar to something that we're used to, like a global map of surface topography that we would also create with maybe like Python, or with for example, with Python or with MATLAB. So you can see the difference now is basically that this is a plane, in this case, in a three-dimensional space. So we can actually move this plane in the three-dimensional space. So it's more or less like still like an image, as we know, but the difference is now this is there's like a geometry underlying this, and if we can activate a sort of like wireframe view and zoom in a bit to actually see that underlying this image, there are like a lot of like triangles, and what we call with like vertices, we call them, basically defining geometry. And we can do interesting stuff with these geometries. Basically, we can change their location in the three-dimensional space. For example, we can, for example, just vertically displace them by the underlying data itself. So like we already have like height data. So basically we can just play around and just vertically like increase like the relief where we have like mountains, for example, and decrease it where we have like ocean, for example. And we can do all of this basically in real time to give some sort of like representation of like a global relief, which is quite helpful. Basically to already show like what kind of data we're looking at. And we added like a lot of different layers here for example, so ocean currents, sea surface temperatures, so on. I just wanted to add a couple of them. So for example, the ocean currents here, these are itself like new objects that we basically put onto this world. If you zoom in again and activate this wireframe view, you can see those are individual geometries that basically we can just position wherever we want in this three-dimensional space and then color them like we want. And in this case, we just like look up at each position where those arrows are, the velocity field from the model, and then we just advance them for each of those frames in the renderer just by a slight bit. And if we do this just like continuously, we get this effect of like a continuous circulation pattern. But you can see that this is all of this is just on a single layer, so basically just like another plane that we add to the model here. And we can basically go ahead and just add more and more layers. For example, in this case, like a sea surface temperature layer is fine. We can also change the number of, for example, the number of arrows that we are displaying here. This is something that I always found quite fascinating when I worked on this, like how much is possible nowadays to work like in the browser with current like modern GPUs. So we can just increase the, like, for example, the number of arrows quite dramatically, and maybe we make it a bit smaller here. But if you zoom in, like these are like in total like roughly like a million of those arrows, and they are all calculated like in real time here on my laptop. So I was always surprised like how much is already possible to do. And at the same time, we can also add like vegetation. For example, these are like 3D models that we can just add here. You can see again, if we add like the wireframe, these are individual models, and they are just like placed at locations where our model predicts, for example, like broadleaf trees or needle-leaf trees. And again, there's like, it's relatively fast, so we can just maybe make them a bit smaller, but we can just add like a lot of them, and it's still running relatively smoothly here on even on a modern laptop. And I think this really helps to just like take this relatively complex data and putting this on this global grid, because you can just easily see like where we have like needle leaf trees here more in North America, or like these broadleaf tropical forests, at least in the model, over the equatorial regions, the ice caps, and then you can go on and on. In this case, for example, adding like precipitation, which is then itself just like another layer, which we place a bit of like a higher altitude to give this sort of like impression that the precipitation is coming from above, or even atmospheric circulation, in this case, like the jet stream. So we're just like adding layer by layer. But what I found interesting is like we add like really like a lot of data. So like so the geography, the circulation, precipitation, vegetation, all of these things. And we didn't add like a single like color bar, for example, at the moment. I mean, I admit that probably like you can't understand all of the data that is in here, but I think even like people that are not used to look at this data can already grasp like a lot of stuff, what is going on, what kind of data is displayed here. So like I said, basically we have full control about like the position of all these underlying geometries in the three-dimensional space. So we can just easily also go there and, for example, change like the projection of data. So I always calculate like Cartesian coordinates and spherical coordinates at the same time. And then we have like more or less just like a weight between both of them to just, to just like go to something like a global view. So like a Google Earth. So like from like plane to just going something which is more realistic, like a Google Earth, and we put like, for example, like a button this here to, then basically we're at the current stage what we have in terms of like how close we can get to something like Google Earth for climate data. There's a lot of stuff that I can't talk about today because like time constraints, but basically we can use this now to go through all sorts of like different time periods of the past when the dinosaurs lived, or even before the dinosaurs even existed. We use this for like some sort of like outreach to look like for the future, next million years. We simulate like fantasy worlds like Dune or the Wheel of Time. And it's, I think, always relatively intuitive to look at this data, and it's just like fun to just play around with this, for example, on a tablet. Just go ahead, play around with this Climatearchive.org, and I think that's all for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Seb. That was a great introduction to your tool as well, and it looks it's really cool to see all of the different ways you can use it shown, because I've had a bit of a play with it, and in the data immersive visualization space that we have at Bristol, I projected it onto the wall, and that was great fun doing that. But I'd never played in that quite so much detail with all the layers, so thanks for demoing that.